Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in words and deeds and relationships of Torah. This week, we are continuing our march through the book of Leviticus. This week, we have a double Torah portion, Tazria-Metzora, which is found beginning with chapter 12, verse 1 in the book of Leviticus. So if you'd like to turn to that section, and then in just a moment, I'll invite all of us to go ahead and unmute, and we can say our blessing for this opportunity of being together within the sea and wisdom of Torah. So let's go ahead and everyone unmute, and together let's say our blessing. Baruch Asher
Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in wonderful body of wisdom and these wonderful relationships that we create together, that of Torah. So we begin with chapter 12, verse 1 of the book of Leviticus. Let me share with you the opening verses, and then I'll invite everyone to have an opportunity to read some verses as well. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. When a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. If she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. Mark Thompson, would you like to go ahead and read beginning at verse 6?
All right. On the completion of her period of purification for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. He shall offer it before the Lord and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be clean from her flow of blood. Such are the rituals concerning her who bears a child, male or female. If, however, her means do not suffice for a sheep, she shall take 2 turtles or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. The priest shall make expiation on her behalf, and she shall be clean.
Thank you, Mark. Richard, would you like to read at the start of chapter 13?
Making me work tonight. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of his body, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the affection on the skin of his body. If hair in the affected patch has turned white and the affection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous affection. When the priest sees it, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if it is a white discoloration on the skin of his body, which does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him, and if the affection has remained unchanged in color and the disease has not spread on the skin, the priest shall isolate him for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affection has faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is a rash. He shall wash his clothes, and he shall be clean. But if the rash should spread on the skin after he has presented himself to the priest and been pronounced clean, he shall present himself again to the priest. And if the priest sees that the rash has spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy.
Thank you, Mark. And Richard Kramer, would you like to read beginning at verse 9?
Yes, thank you. When a person has a scaly affection, it shall be reported to the priest. If the priest finds on the skin a white swelling, which has turned some hair white, with a patch of undiscolored flesh, it is in the swelling, it is a chronic leprosy on the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He need not isolate him, for he is unclean. But if the eruption spreads out over the skin so that it covers all the skin of the affected person from head to foot, wherever the priest can see, if the priest sees that the eruption has covered the whole body, he shall pronounce the affected person clean. Since he has turned all white, he is clean. But as soon as undiscolored flesh appears in it, he shall be unclean. When the priest sees the undiscolored flesh, he shall pronounce him unclean. The undiscolored flesh is unclean. It is leprosy. But if the undiscovered flesh again turns white, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. If the affection has turned white, the priest shall pronounce the affected person clean. He's clean.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Let me invite
Thank you.
Steve, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 18?
Yes. Okay, let me get adjusted here. When an inflammation appears on the skin of one's body and it heals, and a white swelling or a white discoloration streaked with red develops where the inflammation was, he shall present himself to the priest. If the priest finds that it appears lower than the rest of the skin and that the hair in it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous affection that has broken out in the inflammation. But if the priest finds that there is no white hair in it, and it is not lower than the rest of the skin, and it is faded, the priest shall isolate him for 7 days. If it should spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an affection. But if the discoloration remains stationary, not having spread, it is the scar of the inflammation. The priest shall pronounce him clean.
Thank you so much, Steve. Let me invite Martine. Would you like to read beginning at verse 24?
Thank you, Rabbi. When the skin of one's body sustains a burn by fire, and the patch from the burn is a discoloration, either white streaked with red or white, the priest shall examine it. If some hair has turned white in the discoloration, which itself appears to go deeper than the skin, it is leprosy that has broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce the person impure. It is a leprous affection. But if the priest finds that there is no white hair in the discoloration, and that it is not lower than the rest of the skin, and it is faded, the priest shall isolate that person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall conduct an examination. If it has spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce the person impure. It is a leprous affection. But if the discoloration has remained stationary, not having spread on the skin, and it is faded, it is the swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce that person pure, for it is the scar of the burn.
Thank you so much, Martine. Let me invite Dave. Would you like to read beginning at verse 29?
If a man or a woman has an affection on the head or in the beard, the priest shall examine the affection. If it appears to go deeper than the skin, and there is a yellow hair in it, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a scaly eruption in the hair or beard. But if the priest finds the skull affection does not appear to go deeper than the skin, yet there is no black hair in it, the priest shall isolate the person with the skull infection for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine the affection. If the skull has not spread and no yellow hair has appeared in it, and the skull does not appear to go deeper than the skin, the person with the skull shall shave himself, but without shaving the skull, the priest shall isolate him for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine the skull. If the skull has not spread on the skin and does not appear to go deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. He shall wash his clothes, and he shall be clean. If, however, the skull should spread on the skin after he has been pronounced clean, the priest shall examine him. If the skull has spread on the skin, the priest need not look for yellow hair. He is unclean. But if the skull remained unchanged in color and black hair has grown in it, the skull is healed and clean. The priest shall pronounce him clean.
Thank you so much, Dave. Robin, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 38?
Yes, thank you. If a man or a woman has the skin of the body streaked with white discolorations, and the priest sees that the discolorations on the skin of the body are of a dull white, it is a tetter broken out on the skin. That person is pure. If a man loses the hair of his head and becomes bald, he is pure. If he loses the hair on the front part of his head and becomes bald at the forehead, he is pure. But if a white affection streaked with red appears on the bald part in the front or at the back of the head, it is a scaly eruption that is spreading over the bald part in the front or at the back of the head. The priest shall examine him. If the swollen affection on the bald part in the front or at the back of his head is white, streaked with red, like the leprosy of body, skin, and appearance, he is among the leprous. He is impure. The priest shall pronounce him impure. He has the affection on his head.
Thank you so much. And Mark Levinstein, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 45?
Thank you. As for the person with a leprous affection, his clothes shall be rent, his head shall be left bare, and he shall cover his upper lip. And he shall call out, unclean, unclean. And he shall be unclean as long as the disease is on him. Being unclean, he shall dwell apart. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. When an eruptive affection occurs on a cloth of wool or linen fabric, in the warp or in the woof of the linen or the wool, or in a skin or in anything made of skin, if the affection in the cloth or the skin, in the warp or the woof, or in any article of skin is streaky green or red, it is an eruptive affection. It shall be shown to the priest, and the priest, after examining the affection, shall isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he shall examine the affection. If the affection is spread in the cloth, whether in the warp or the woof or in the skin, for whatever purpose the skin may be used, the affection is a malignant eruption. It is unclean. The cloth, whether warp or woof, in wool or linen, or any article of skin in which the affection is found, shall be burned, for it is a malignant eruption. It shall be consumed in fire. But if the priest sees that the affection in the cloth, whether in the warp or the woof, or in any article of skin is not spread, the priest shall order the affected article washed, and he shall isolate it for another 7 days. And if after that the affected article has been washed, the priest sees that the affection has not changed color, that it is not spread, it is unclean. It shall be consumed in fire. It is a fret, whether on its inner side or on its outer side. But if the priest sees that the affected part, after which it has been washed, is faded, he shall tear it out of the cloth or skin, whether in the warp or in the woof. And if it occurs again in the cloth, whether in the warp or in the woof, or in any article of skin, it is a wild growth. The affected article shall be consumed in fire. If, however, the affection disappears from the cloth, warp or woof, or from any article of skin that has been washed, it shall be washed again, and it shall be clean. Such is the procedure for an eruptive affection of cloth, wool, or linen, in warp or in woof, or in any article of skin, pronouncing it clean or unclean.
Thank you so much. And David and Susan, would you like to read some beginning at the start of chapter 14?
Yes, thank you. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the ritual for a leper at the time of being purified. When it has been reported to the priest shall go outside the camp. If he sees that the leper has been healed of the scaly infection, affection, the priest shall order 2 live pure birds, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop to be brought for the one to be purified. The priest shall order one of the birds slaughtered over fresh water in an earthen vessel, and he shall take the live bird along with the cedar wood, the crimson stuff, and the hyssop, and dip them together with the live bird in the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. He shall then sprinkle it 7 times on the one to be purified of the eruption and effect the purification. And he shall set the live bird free in the open country. The one to be purified shall wash those clothes, shave off all hair, and bathe in water, and then shall be pure. After that, the camp may be entered, but one must remain outside one's tent 7 days. On the 7th day, all hair shall be shaved off, of head, beard, if any, and eyebrows. Having shaved off all hair, the person shall wash those clothes and bathe the body in water, and then shall be pure. On the 8th day, that person shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb in its first year without blemish, 1 ewe lamb, 3/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in for a meal offering, and 1 log of oil. These shall be presented before Adonai with the person to be purified at the entrance of the tent of meeting by the priest who performs the purification.
Different translation. And the priest shall take one of the lambs, bring it forward as a guilt offering, and the log of oil, and he shall elevate them, an elevation offering in front of Hashem. And he shall slaughter the lamb in the place where he slaughters the sin offering and the burnt offering in the place of the holy, because like the sin offering, the guilt offering is the priest's. It's the holy of holies. And the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the right earlobe of the one being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it on the priest's left hand. And the priest shall dip his right finger in some of the oil that is on his left hand, and sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times in front of Hashem. And the priest shall put some of the remaining oil that is on his hand on the right earlobe of the one being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the blood of the guilt offering. And he shall put what is left of the oil that's on the priest's hand on the head of the one being purified, and the priest shall make atonement over him in front of Hashem. And the priest shall make the sin offering and make atonement over the one being purified from his impurity. And after that, he shall slaughter the burnt offering. And the priest shall make the burnt offering and the grain offering at the altar, and the priest shall make atonement over him, and he will be pure.
Thank you both so much. And Jay, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 21?
Thank you, Rabbi. If, however, he is poor and his means are insufficient, he shall take 1 male lamb for a guilt offering to be elevated in expiation for him, 1/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in for a meal offering, and a log of oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, depending on his means, the one to be the sin offering and the other the burnt offering. On the 8th day of his cleansing, he shall bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest shall take the lamb of guilt offering and the log of oil and elevate them as an elevation offering before the Lord. When the lamb of guilt offering has been slaughtered, the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the ridge of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The priest shall then pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and with the finger of his right hand, the priest shall sprinkle some of the oil that is in the palm of his left hand 7 times before the Lord. Some of the oil in his palm shall be put by the priest on the ridge of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the same place as the blood of the guilt offering. And what is left of the oil in his palm, the priest shall put on the head of the one being cleansed to make expiation for him before the Lord. He shall then offer one of the turtle doves or pigeons, depending on his means, whichever he can afford, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, together with the meal offering. Thus the priest shall make expiation before the Lord for the one being cleansed. Such is the ritual for him who has a scaly affection and whose means for his cleansing are limited.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much. Paul, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 33?
Thank you, Rabbi. And the Lord spoke unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, You for a possession, and I put the plague of leprosy on the house of the land of your possession. Then shall he that owneth the house come and tell the priest, saying, Something like leprosy has shown itself to me in the house. And the priest shall command that they clear out the house before the priests go into it to see the plague, that all be not made unclean that is in the house. And after this shall the priest go in to see the house, and he shall view the plague, and behold, if the plague be in the walls of the house, with hollow strokes, greenish or reddish, and their appearance be deeper than the wall, then shall the priest go out of the house to the door of the house and lock up the house 7 days. And the priest shall come again on the 7th day, and if he see that, behold, the plague have spread in the walls of the house, then shall the priest command that they break out the stones on which the plague is, and they shall cast them forth without the city on an unclean place. And the house he shall cause to be scraped within round about, and they shall pour out the rubbish that they have scraped off without the city on an unclean place. And they shall take the other stones and put them into that place of these stones. And other mortar shall he take and shall plaster the house.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Let me invite Jim and Peggy, if you'd like to read starting at verse 43.
Thank you, Rabbi. If the plague again breaks out in the house, after the stones have been pulled out, and after the house has been scraped and replastered, the priest shall come to examine. If the plague has spread in the house, it is a malignant eruption in the house. It is unclean. The house shall be torn down, its stones and timber and all the coating on the house, and taken to an unclean place outside the city. Whoever enters the house while it is closed up shall be unclean until evening. Whoever sleeps in the house must wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house must wash his clothes. If, however, the priest comes and sees that the plague has not spread in the house after the house was replastered, the priest shall pronounce the house clean, for the plague has healed. To purge the house, he shall take 2 birds, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop. He shall slaughter the one bird over fresh water in an earthen vessel. He shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the crimson stuff, and the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle on the house 7 times. Having purged the house with the blood of the bird, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the crimson stuff, he shall set the live bird free outside the city in the open country. Thus he shall make expiation for the house, and it shall be clean.
Such is the ritual for every eruptive affection, for scales, for an eruption on a cloth or a house, for swellings, for rashes, or for discolorations, to determine when they are unclean and when they are clean. such as the ritual concerning eruptions. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any man has a discharge issuing from his member, he is unclean. The uncleanness from his discharge shall mean the following: whether his member runs with the discharge or is stopped up so that there is no discharge. His uncleanliness means this: any bedding on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean, and every object on which he sits shall be unclean. Anyone who touches his bedding shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Whoever sits on an object on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Whoever touches the body of the one with the discharge shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. If one with the discharge spits on one who is clean, the latter shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Any means for riding that one with the discharge is mounted shall be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until evening. And whoever carries such things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. If one with the discharge, without having rinsed his hands in water, touches another person, that person shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. An earthen vessel that one with the discharge touches shall be broken, and any wooden implement shall be rinsed with water."
Thank you both so much. Ruth, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 13?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. When one with a discharge becomes purified of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his purification. Wash those clothes and bathe his body in fresh water. Then he shall be pure. On the 8th day, he shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons and come before the Eternal at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest shall offer them, the one as a purgation offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the priest shall make expiation on his behalf for his discharge before the Eternal. When a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain impure until evening. All cloth or leather on which semen falls shall be washed in water and remain impure until evening. Likewise for a woman, when a man has carnal relations with her, both shall bathe in water and remain impure until evening. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge being blood from her body, she shall remain in her menstrual separation 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be impure until evening. Anything that she lies on during her menstrual separation shall be impure, and anything that she sits on shall be impure. All those who touch her bedding shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. And all those who touch any object on which she has sat shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. Be it the bedding or be it the object on which she has sat, on touching it, one shall be impure until evening. And if a man lies with her, her menstrual separation applies to him. He shall be impure 7 days, and any bedding on which he lies shall become impure.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Carol, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 25?
Thank you, Rabbi. When a woman has had a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity, or when she has a discharge beyond her period of impurity, she shall be unclean as though at the time of her impurity, as long as her discharge lasts. Any bedding on which she lies while her discharge lasts shall be for her like bedding during her impurity, and any object on which she sits shall become unclean, as it does during her impurity. Whoever touches them shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. When she becomes clean of her discharge, she shall count off 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. On the 8th day, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and the priest shall make expiation on her behalf for her unclean discharge before the Lord.
Go ahead. Why don't you finish up our portion there?
Okay. You shall put the Israelites on guard against their uncleanness, lest they die through their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle, which is among them. Such is the ritual concerning him who has a discharge, concerning him who has an emission of semen and becomes unclean thereby, and concerning her who is in menstrual infirmity, and concerning anyone, male or female, who has a discharge, and concerning a man who lies with an unclean woman.
Thank you, Karen. That's our entire portion for this week. Tazria-Metzora. Thank you very much, everyone, for vocalizing it and bringing it before us so that we can discuss it. So one of the key themes, obviously, in this week's Torah portion has to do with notions of purity and impurity, tahor and tameh, of the terms that are used. So first of all, I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking in this context about purity and impurity, the text is not talking about biological purity and impurity. It's talking about spiritual, ritual, that is ritual purity or impurity. So first, there are several categories that cause us to suffer some degree of impurity according to the text. And some of those items are contact with a human corpse, contacts with certain creeping creatures, contact with dead animals, issues from skin eruptions. So all of these, for some reason or other, bring some measure of ritual impurity, which then requires some kind of practice, some kind of procedure in order to recover from that degree of impurity. So I'd like to kind of delve into this a little bit about, well, what exactly is the nature of this purity and impurity? And we've encountered, of course, these rather extensive and maybe perhaps so seemingly esoteric procedures for emerging out of a degree of impurity as a result of contact with one of these objects or experiences that I've listed. I have shown at the top of our study sheet a painting by Yoram Ra'anan he called Purification, which emerges out of this week's Torah portion, in fact. Perhaps you can see in the middle, there's a figure, and in front of the figure, there's a bowl, and in the bowl, that person is mixing the mixture that we have just read about. And Yoram Ra'anan has his own commentary about this. He says, crimson thread, wool dyed with pigment made from a simple creature, and hyssop, a lowly plant, both symbolize humility. Well, we're going to pursue this notion that our artist, Yoram Ra'anan, is highlighting, that there's something about the ingredients that go into this mixture that help restore a sense of purity to us as having something to do with humility. So we're going to kind of get into this by delving into one of the more famous and fascinating stories that we have in the Talmud, called the Oven of Achnai. So as a way to get into this story that appears in the Talmud as part of Gemara in Bava Metzia, that's the name of the volume, the tractate. When we look at Talmud, there are actually two sections within Talmud. There is Mishnah, those are rabbinic teachings that got codified, reduced to writing around the year of 200 in the Common Era. And then what flows from that are discussions that occurred over the next several hundred years, rabbis trying to debate, well, what did those rabbis who produced the Mishnah, what did they mean by what they said in their interpretation of what Torah said? And so that second bit of commentary is known as the Gemara. So whenever one studies a little bit of Gemara, it's always helpful to take a step back and look at what exactly provoked the Gemara discussion. What was the Mishnah that this discussion is all about? So here's the Mishnah that this story somehow is precipitated by. So the Mishnah says basically this: just as there is a prohibition against exploitation in buying and selling, so is there exploitation in verbal misuse. And the Mishnah cites as authority for this a verse from the book of Leviticus, a few chapters on, in fact, from chapter 25. In chapter 25, verse 7, it says, "Do not wrong one another." Now, the context for that verse in the book of Leviticus is a discussion about rules about buying and selling land, especially as it relates to the Jubilee year. And basically says, don't cheat a person when you are buying and selling land. So the Mishnah then goes on to say about that verse, this verse is about verbal mistreatment, not just monetary exploitation. So the Mishnah has set up some principles about how one should speak to another, that there is a form of exploitation involved in terms of not just how we exchange money and property, but how we exchange our language with one another. So that sets up the Gemara discussion that takes place over the next 300 years after the publication of the Mishnah. So here is the setup for the story that we're going to read in the Gemara. So the Gemara discussion somehow evolves over many, many pages to a discussion about several cases in which one of the most prominent rabbis of his age, Rabbi Eliezer, declared a number of items as being pure. So now you can begin to see why I'm bringing this story up to just in the context of our Torah portion, because it's going to be dealing with matters of purity and impurity. So Rabbi Eliezer said in a number of cases, he was a decisor saying, this is pure, that case is pure, this situation is pure. And finally, they get to a case involving an oven that a rodent has crawled into. And so there's some discussion among all the rabbis. Now that a rodent has crawled into this oven, how do we make it pure again? Can we just scrape it, the insides a little bit? Do we have to completely tear it down and rebuild it? And Rabbi Eliezer says, don't worry, the oven is pure. And he tries to convince them logically, the rest of the rabbis logically, that the oven is pure. And the majority of the rabbis are not buying his argument. And so having failed to convince his colleagues logically, he then proceeds to use what we will call some extra natural arguments. He then says, if I'm right, let that tree over there uproot itself and move several feet. And lo and behold, it does, but the rest of the rabbis are still not convinced. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, If I'm right in my position, let that stream of water over there start to flow backwards. And lo and behold, it does. But still, the majority of the rabbis are not convinced even by that. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right in my position, let the walls of this study hall begin to lean inward. And lo and behold, they do. And suddenly one of the rabbis yells out, walls, stop leaning inward. And they stop. And finally, Rabbi Eliezer resorts to what seems like the ultimate in a beyond natural form of proof. And that's how we get into our story as it's printed on the study sheet. Rabbi Eliezer said, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion. Rabbi Yeshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven, from Deuteronomy. And then the Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halacha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. There is a long sequel to this story. The relationship between Rabbi Eliezer and the majority of the rabbis begins to deteriorate significantly. He is in effect shunned by the rest. And so we're going to see, well, what's the connection now between this notion of purity and what's happening within this story? So first of all, the name of this oven is called the oven of Achnai. So the word Achnai comes from the Hebrew, it comes from the verb achan, which means to be curved. And from it, we also get a word for snake. So we have this notion of a coilingness, okay? So what does this, why is this word used in relationship to this particular oven? The Talmud says, the rabbis encircled the matter with discussions as a snake winds itself around an object. There's something that is very displeasing, very unpleasant, something sinister about how this discussion is taking place. And that's because we have this principle that was articulated actually in the story itself, that is from a verse in the book of Exodus, which is that decisions are supposed to be made by majority rule. The problem here is that Eliezer, who is considered perhaps the most august, the most significant of all the rabbis at the time, was insisting that his opinion was right. And he continued to try and prove it time and time again, even calling upon the laws of nature to reverse themselves in order to demonstrate that he was right and everyone else is wrong. So the story, in a sense, is expressing concern with issues about law and authority, about what happens when a community becomes so fractured as a result of someone holding too strongly to their opinions. What happens when the process for decision-making becomes somehow corrupt, and the danger of authoritarian versus majority rule. This whole discussion about how people talk to one another, how people make decisions as a community, that whole story is in this context of a discussion about matters of purity and impurity. the Talmud seems to be teaching us something about purity and impurity has to do with our relationships with one another and how we treat one another and how we make decisions and have discussions as a community. This is brought forward very beautifully in a poem by Yehuda Amichai, which I have printed on the backside of the study sheet. And it's a poem he calls "The Place Where We Are Right." Let me share that with you. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a courtyard. But doubts and wondering dig up the world like a mole, like a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the house once stood that was destroyed. This poem by Yehuda Amichai is mentioned in a blog I stumbled across by Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer is one of the great educators in the United States today. I believe he's now retired from teaching. I think it was at the University of Michigan. He still conducts kind of master classes and does some teaching. But he has a wonderful book called The Courage to Teach. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But he incorporated this poem by Yehuda Amichai on a blog he wrote. And then he says this: nothing new can grow between us when we speak to each other from the place where we are right. And then Parker Palmer in his blog said, imagine if our conversations were based not on our certainties, but on our doubts, our curiosities, and our love. Jewish tradition is saying something about the nature of impurity, and that basically what impurity is about is separation from holiness, from God, from integration with all of life. And especially within the Hasidic tradition, impurity is understood as an excessive assertion of self. Because when we over-assert ourselves, that's when we begin to break these bonds of connection with one another, with community, with creation, and it becomes within that understanding a form of idolatry, a love of self over others. So the house that Yehuda Amichai is talking about in his poem is the temple. The temple, the second temple that was destroyed in the year 70 CE. And according to Jewish tradition, while the Romans may have been the external force that ultimately destroyed the temple really was destroyed before the Romans ever used their battering rams to break into it. The temple, according to Jewish tradition, was destroyed because of senseless and baseless hatred among the Jewish people themselves. It was that degree of corruption and separation and disintegration within the community, the way people were treating one another, the way they talked with one another, that caused that house to fall. And Yehuda Amichai in his poem is telling us that that house may have fallen, but it is whispers, not shouts, but whispers may be the material for a rebuilding of communal structure. And that helps us to re-achieve a sense of purity. So with that, I'd love to hear what provoked you, what interested you, what you thought about as we were reading this week's Torah portion. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'd love to call on you and hear what you thought about what we read. Yes, Richard.
Well, two things. One, at the very beginning, I got the number here, 12:8. If a woman does not have, if her means does not suffice. And it mentions that too with men, but it just made me wonder, well, does this woman with the children, does she have a husband? Is there a family? Or is this an expression of equal rights? Or I was just puzzled by that. And the other was that the house that is affected as an affection, it's after it's declared healed, but before it's declared clean, there is a purgation offering, as though the house itself has some role in having become unclean, as though it's a person that needs to be purgated of whatever it was that led for them to have this uncleanliness and impurity. And that kind of left me scratching. And I like what you're saying about Rabbi Eliezer, that notwithstanding he has great paranormal powers, he's studied hard, he's done his meditation, he's got it in with the old man upstairs, and he can do stuff. But that has nothing whatsoever to do with healing the rift in the community for doing some kind of democratic process. And I thought about, I kept writing down CDC, 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 Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. And who do you believe about what? And what's the best approach to take in all that, but to be quiet, settle down, and do what you have the feeling that's right and what the majority are doing. I don't know what the answer is, but boy, this brings that up a lot. The notion of who has the power to say what we're supposed to do, and what does that exercise of power have, how does that affect the way in which we respond to what we're being told about the situation? Do we then fight with the person who has the power? Are we blocked from taking in the information? And that's what I think you're saying is this brings out for us.
Thank you, Richard. It is fascinating to see this, how these affections become implicated in houses, in bodies, in cloth, as if there is no distinction really between human objects, natural objects, humanly built objects. It's that there's some integration, that we all share a kind of vulnerability to becoming infected in some kind of ways. And go ahead, Jay.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead. Thank you.
There appears to be a measure of permanence in their habitation here in the desert. I mean, you learn as a kid from the time you're 3 years old that the Jews in the Haggadah, we wandered for 40 years in the desert, and they were wandering. But to build houses and to have these communities, it seems like some measure of permanence in any one given place at any one given time. I was just wondering if you could comment on that. Again, if you look at it allegorically and spiritually, that answers it all. But let's look at it kind of historically and see how that's possible, that they had the time. I guess 40 years is a long time, but they did stay in one place for some period of time to build houses.
So here's the really fascinating thing. So thank you for bringing that up, Jay. It says, chapter 14, verse 34, when you enter the land of Canaan, that I give to you as a possession, and I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house in the land you possess. So it is anticipating this happening once they're in the promised land. And what kind of struck me about that is these people are wandering, and now they're being told, by the way, when you get to what we're calling the promised land, it's not going to be perfect. There's still going to be these infections that are going to arise. There's still going to be these moments of fracture. There's still going to be imperfections. And to me, that's fascinating to be anticipating as you're going towards there that, we're leaving this place called Egypt and we're going to go somewhere and there's still going to be problems. that we're going to have to deal with. I think that's a very profound message, and it takes great courage for this voice to be saying that while they're still underway. So thank you for pointing that out. Susan, go ahead and unmute.
Martine have
David.
Dave Lieb and Martine have their electronic hands up.
Okay, thank you. I see that now. Thank you.
Okay.
Just a small comment that, like Richard, I mean, this portion to me brings home that the health of the community is paramount, that we all have a responsibility to make sure that we don't jeopardize the health of the community. And so I related that also to the pandemic, that it's right that we're not going to synagogue, and it's right that we're keeping ourselves apart in order to make everybody safe and healthy.
Thank you, Susan. So, and thank you also for reminding me to look at those hands that are raised digitally. So Martine, yeah.
Thank you. A couple things. I've always had trouble with the oven story. And I see on one hand the importance of, a democratic view of things, of, taking a vote and having the majority. And I also see the danger of this. When logic and truth are displaced because of the will of the many. And we can talk about, everything from the states that have treated COVID as if it's nothing more than, allergies versus, those that have followed what the CDC and World Health Organization and Dr. Fauci are saying, yes, do this. All the way to, what happened January 6th, to, back to slavery, where everybody thought, in many states that the majority said, oh, slavery's fine. And I just, today, for the first time, I thought about the little boy in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, and the danger when we as a group can't see through truth and logic.
So just very quickly, the notion of having some kind of communal process for decision-making that is very suspicious of authoritarian figures, of elevating people because of their stature to be able to sway an entire community. I think that's what this rabbinic experience is expressly concerned about. And also because only by having a communal decision-making process that encourages everyone to think that their argument could be persuasive, that equal to anyone else's, no matter how higher in communal stature the other person might be, that we need to create a process that encourages everyone to think that their point of view matters. So I think that's the radical notion. That's the radical sense of the rabbinic experience that's being promoted here. But thank you for pointing that out. We always need to be concerned, of course, about what happens with a majority that doesn't care about science, or doesn't care, that gets swept up in passion and things like that. Of course, those are things we need to be concerned about. So thank you for bringing that corrective up. Dave?
What's kind of curious to me was the first part of this parsha we dealt with some sort of illness, they call it leprosy, but something that is not normal. Then let's contrast with the second part of it, which deals with the normal functioning of our reproductive parts,
Right.
which likewise seems to be considered not normal. Maybe you could explain that a little bit more.
Very good. It's good to have caught on those distinctions. So the tradition is saying there are some encounters that we have that are disruptive and extraordinary. And then there are some other experiences we have that, as you've so well put, are just part of the natural biological cycle of human beings. And the tradition is saying they're different and they're treated differently. And the sense of what it means to be impure, let's say, in terms of those biological cycles, is not that you've done anything wrong. It's just that that particular experience has somehow caused you to have a sense of separation from, well, in the religious sense, from God. So let's just take, for example, the woman who's had just born a child. So the notion is that there's been this peak experience of being a bearer of life, which puts that puts the woman in contact with the source of all life. And then there's this moment of period of separation from that. And so she needs a period of recovery from that separation. It's not that she doesn't do anything wrong. It's just a recovery period from this extraordinary encounter with, if you will, the unity of life, and then a separation from it. So it's good to have made that distinction, Dave, between these encounters with these extraordinary events coming upon a human corpse and so forth, and then those experiences that have an effect on us that are part of our normal biological process. Thank you. And Paul.
Yeah, I'm a little bit disturbed, a little bit like what Dave was saying. It seems like before they go to the midbar, the God has a repertoire of at least 9 plagues. Okay, we'll forget about the last one. So the people are familiar with those, you know, the Dhamma and all that stuff. Okay, now suddenly we have literally almost a whole chapter devoted to leprosy. And so, and in such detail, in really detail. And so is there some sort of message that why did he pick leprosy when he had 9 other items he could have picked? And I just didn't know the reasoning behind it.
Okay, so there's a few different ways to look at this. One is kind of a point of view that I've raised in previous teachings about the book of Leviticus, which is that the book of Leviticus is a rather unique voice within Torah that has the point of view about how important it is to have clear distinctions and boundaries and borders and so forth. And that when we have eruptions of those boundaries and borders, when they become porous and when one boundaries collapse and things mix, that this point of view is concerned about that, becomes uncomfortable with that. Okay? And there's something to be said about that point of view of having kind of clear definitions and distinctions. So it may be that that the story here is being told about the eruption of the skin now oozing out, things coming out from underneath the skin as being an expression of that kind of horror concern about when boundaries and definitions are breached, if you will. So I think kind of the overall picture is that what this story and the tradition is acknowledging is that we become, to have a sense of infection or corruption, or better in the spiritual sense, to become detached somewhat from a sense of integration with all of life is a fundamental aspect of being alive. That's just what happens. We go through life and we become distracted. We become infected by our own urges for selfishness and for acquisition, and then we become detached. And the tradition is acknowledging that that's what happens, and that there are ways to recover from it. Okay, and it's this notion of these rituals that's described here is just an kind of if you will, a stand-in for other kinds of ways that we can recover from these moments where we become overcome by these forces that are pulling us away from one another, pulling us away from sense of communal adhesion. Okay, so that's my
I enjoy how you think, by the way. Really appreciate these answers.
I feel the same way about the way you think, Paul. Thank you. And Richard, you had something more you wanted to add? And go ahead and unmute, Richard.
I notice in my translation, the word is affection.
Yeah.
And it's different than infection.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Mark Levinstein, would you say something about the word affection?
That's attitude.
An affection is.
Yeah, I think I don't know why you asked me that, but thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, affection, it makes me think of affect, of feeling, of attitude, as opposed to the more medical sense of infection.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think it has a deeper, if you will, sense, a more holistic sense. And David or Susan, did you want to add something as well?
I unmuted.
Yes. I just wanted to say that when I personally look at some of these
conditions,
I guess I'm going to call them rules here in Leviticus. If I look at them as guidance, like after giving birth, it really is kind of nice to be able to withdraw and allow your body to recover. If you read the Red Tent, the women liked the time that they had to themselves, where they were relegated to the tent that they had to live in. And I think that the difficulty comes when we're told we have to. That's all.
Rabbi Richard Elliott Friedman, which is the translation I'm reading, translates what you're reading as affection or affection as affliction.
Okay.
I don't know the Hebrew word.
So, this is something you wanted to say? Go ahead.
Can I speak over?
Okay.
I'm just thinking about the hyssop in all of this. You know, wash me with hyssop and I shall be clean. Hyssop is an herb. It has probably the most beautiful flower of all plants that we call herbs, beautiful purple flowers. And if you care to look it up, I mean, you just have to Google it. Hyssop is used to treat all sorts of things. It's an herb that we use to cook with. It treats like uterine disorders, for example, which might apply to this. It's an antiseptic, it's an antispasmodic, it's a carminative, it's a sedative, it's an anti-inflammatory. And I mean, this, I had no idea. I've grown it before, but I really had no idea. And I think it's just quite beautiful that we have this little insertion of this beautiful plant that we can eat and drink, and it will heal infections of the skin or eruptions or boils. I mean, that's what it can be used to treat for. And it's even used, it's one of the primary flavorings in Benedictine, and also what's the green liqueur? Is it chartreuse?
Absinthe?
Chartreuse, perhaps. I think chartreuse. So it's Isn't it just amazing how all of these things work together? All the words of Torah and all the thoughts of the ancient rabbis and our rabbi and all of us together. Isn't it just amazing? This little plant hyssop has all these hidden talents and possibilities, and so do we. That makes me really happy.
They're very soothing.
So
Yeah.
I'm just going to return us back to the words of our artist, Yoram Ra'anan, on his painting Purification. Crimson thread, wool dyed with pigment made from a simple creature, and hyssop, a lowly plant, both symbolize humility. That seems to be the primary elements in a mixture that helps us to regain a sense of purity, a sense of reattachment to one another and to holiness and to the source of all life, a sense of humility. With that, I humbly say, I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity to study together, to be together, and to enrich one another's lives. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming together. I look forward to seeing you next week. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I love it, Jay.
Oh, good.